I present to you the anthem of the Estonian forest brothers. Seal metsa serval väikses majas, kus elasid mu vanemad. Seal metsa serval väikses majas, pesa teinud punased. Aitša, ai veled, me metsavennad oleme. Aitša, ai veled, me metsavennad eestlased. Forest brothers were the ones who went to the forest and fought against the Soviet troops when Soviet Union invaded Estonia. They were the freedom fighters of Estonia, and now you know their anthem. Just a little historical musical part before we dive into this video. I went to the comments, I read the comments, and turns out many of you want Binkov's Battlegrounds. Binkov, a Slavic name. Binkov's Battlegrounds. I went to the channel, I found one of the most watched videos, which is U.S. Supercarrier, like the name already, versus the entire Japanese World War II Navy. I like this stuff. I like the what-if scenarios, and I like supercarriers of the United States of America. The carriers of freedom, as I call them. And now we'll find out if one of those carriers could defeat the entire Japanese Navy of World War II. Before we start, of course, patrons everywhere surrounding this channel, carrying this channel into the sunset. I am thankful for the patrons, so I will name 3 new names. And to answer your question, Joe Brozek asked me this, for me to read out your name. Doesn't matter how big or small of a patron you are. $1 or something more, I will read out your name the same. If you pledge a bigger amount, it's all on you. There is no tiers that you have to be big to be mentioned. I will mention everybody, but if you pledge more, thank you for doing that. That's all I can say. I am grateful for you. We have David Trokinski, Polish, maybe? Polish? I don't know, probably American. Thank you for becoming a Patreon. We have Colin Blatt. Well, Blatt in Russian means the female genitalia. But this is Blatt. Thank you for becoming a Patreon. Finally, we have Evan A. Thank you, Evan A, for becoming a Patreon. If you can allow it to yourself, if you're feeling generous, hit the link in the description and support the channel. Alright, my friends, let's see if a US carrier could defeat the entire Japanese Navy of World War II. I think it can.
On one side, America's Supercarrier and 3 escorting ships, which make up its strike group, packing over 70 aircraft altogether. On the opposing side,
70 F-35s or F-22s, I'm presuming, which could take down an entire country.
The entire Imperial Japanese Navy of World War II. At its peak in 1942, it had over 280 ocean-going vessels. The US carrier group gets whisked away to 1942, replacing all of the US Navy forces from said period. Can one carrier group hold on against Japan, or could it even wreck the entire Japanese Navy?
Binkov's Battlegrounds, the first video I've seen
One
of
of the
them.
comments we always get is, I want to be a back to our Pacific setup.
No.
The US Navy losing all their ships, planes and men they had in one magical moment would be a heavy blow. But the technological edge a supercarrier strike group offers might just compensate for it. This scenario will assume the switch happens in the spring of 1942. The Japanese realize the playground is much more open, but don't realize what exactly happened. They certainly don't expect a futuristic carrier. The Battle of the Coral Sea never happens, and the Japanese, emboldened by their successes around Indonesia, set their sights on the entire Hawaii archipelago. But if their midway battle-to-be force approached the outlying islands, it would get noticed by the US carrier group. The E-2 aerial early warning planes can see objects far out to the horizon, especially large warships. While the E-2 is labeled as an AWACS-like plane, another one of its core mission sets is ocean surveillance. The plane's radar wavelength was chosen to perform well against naval targets. If really needed, the carrier group could maintain an E-2 scanning around with its radar and making sure nothing gets past.
Hey, we're talking about modern carriers versus Japanese Navy, radar was just invented. I mean, it was invented a little bit before, but at the time of 1942, radar technology was in its infants. It was so young. Supercarrier has such a strong radar, it would know every step of the enemy before they make it. I think the intelligence is uncomparable. Incomparable? Not comparable here.
For several days before maintenance schedule matters kick in. Though it's more likely some of the helicopters of the air wing would aid at times when no threat is expected. The air wing of a strike group carries anywhere from half a dozen to 20 helicopters, depending on the size of the strike group. They're divided between the carrier itself and the escort ships. For the purpose of this scenario, we will assume one of the most typical peacetime patrol strike group compositions. 2 Berg-class destroyers, 1 Ticonderoga-class cruiser and a dozen helicopters between them and the carrier. Although supply ships and submarines oftentimes help the strike group in certain missions, they're usually not part of the strike group.
I mean, if you would take one modern submarine of U.S.A, I think that could take down the entire Japanese Navy. A nuclear sub that could stay submerged forever. Japanese, and also I am presuming it's stealth, so it's invisible to the infantry of the young raiders or new raiders of Japanese Navy, which is not that good compared to the modern raiders. It's just an invisible death from below the waves. You cannot kill it, you cannot see it, you don't know what hit you, and the firepower they have. I mean, this is a fun video, but I think the answer is already known. Yes, they could destroy everything.
When not needed. So in this instance, they have not traveled in time with the carrier. So what would happen is this: Japanese ships would get noticed and aircraft would be sent to confirm the targets. The World War II technology that Japanese have would not even alert them to the fact enemy radar is present and watching them. Then some strike groups would get assembled, taking off from the carrier. For the Nimitz-class ships,
okay, we have F-18. Oh, everything F-18, right? Which is a very good plane, don't get me wrong. F-22 and F-35, they're just newer. But F-18, oh, it's a beast. It's a beast, definitely.
Have 4 strike plane squadrons. All this does assume at least several days for both the carrier group and the US nation of that period to actually come to terms with the whole fantastical premise and the new reality of the situation. To simplify, the US nation accepts its new carrier and the loss of its previous assets, and the carrier promptly accepts its role as the sole defender, as well as coordinates with the US government. Let's go back.
That doesn't happen ever, never, ever, ever, but in this video, of course it does. The US government is like, against the whole invasion force of Japan and against the whole navy of Japan, we have this one futuristic carrier. Let's send the futuristic carrier. It can do the trick. One carrier is enough. No need for send more. One is enough. Send one. Can you smell that? That's the smell of the Estonian soldier hat. Ooh, and it's good. We have 5 new names. Maybe not new, maybe they already have 2 hats. Who knows? But we will put them on the board. And maybe Washington will be overtaken by Texas or California. We have Christian Morales with high morals, because Morales means high morals. That's why he got the hat. It's a man. Yeah, he, of course. Thank you, Christian, for getting the hat. The city is called Dumas, and it's in Texas. 39 points for Texas. Slowly creeping up there, taking over Washington, maybe. We have Evan Atkinson. Yes, we have Rowan Atkinson, aka Mr. Bean, and he had a kid, a boy. He named it Evan, and that Evan is now getting the Estonian soldier hat. From Texas. Again, Texas. San Antonio, Texas. Oh, giving me a rest, Texas. 40 points for the Texas. We have Mark Tim. That's a name that could be Estonian. I mean, it's not the most common one, but it could be. Mark Tim with the 2 M's. Not Texas this time. The dude is a special dude because he got 2 hats. 2. It's bigger than 1. City is called Monticello, and that's in Indiana, as in Indiana Jones. Where is Indiana? Where are you? I will find you. Ah, Indiana. Indiana has 8. We have Teres Irvin. Now, is that a man or a woman? I do not know, but it doesn't matter because this hat is unisex. City is Bensalem. and the state is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania. 9 points for Pennsylvania. Finally, we have Clayton. Yes, it's Clayton, but I say Clayton lamb, as in sheep. Sheep lamb. City is Wellington, and the state is Ohio. Ohio is 9, it's going to be 10. Yeah, baby. A beautiful 10. What did I do when I was 10 years old? I played Minecraft and discovered my body. That's the... Thank you, my friends, for getting the hats. Thank you. That supports the channel. In every video I read 5 names for you. Go and get the hat to put your name in the video and put the point behind your state. Let's go back to the video.
Back to that strike. The Japanese would likely be detected hundreds of miles away from the Midway Islands, and waves of F-18s would likely be sent. The US Navy doesn't currently have LRASM missiles widely deployed, as the weapon only entered early operational status in October 2019. Said missile would be overkill for the mission at hand. It's too heavy and only 2 missiles could be carried by a Super Hornet. Most likely the initial strike would be performed by the Harpoon anti-ship missiles. US planes,
which is totally, I don't know what the Harpoon is, but if it's invented after the 1970s or 80s, I'm sure it is capable to take down an entire ship with 1 or 2 blows.
Would likely get pretty close, especially the planes that observe the damage with targeting pods. But flying at over 40,000 feet, they would be completely safe from Japanese interceptors.
Yep.
The electronic jamming planes could also join the effort, blinding any radars the Japanese might hope to use. Basically, it would be a turkey shoot. Lighter and unarmored targets such as the carriers could be hit with Harpoon missiles. The Japanese might use 8 or so fleet or light carriers in this alternate timeline. But each...
Think about this, we have F-18s that go so fast you cannot shoot them or attack them back with anything that you have. The Zeros, the planes, their speed doesn't even compare, they cannot shoot them. Plus their machine guns won't do any damage to the F-18s, I think. Then you have the AA guns on the boats, anti-aircraft guns. They cannot shoot a plane that is going so fast. I mean, you gotta be a god marksman to hit a plane that's going over speed of sound. And you hit it with your machine gun, like, it's not possible. The only way to take those planes down, I think, is a guided missile, which they don't have.
Hit from a Harpoon missile would be at least as devastating as the bombs that did hit the carriers in the real timeline. The bombs hit the ships at medium subsonic speeds, somewhat slower than the Harpoon's impact speed, and Harpoons might have some propellant left to burn upon explosion. There would be almost no way for the Japanese to intercept those missiles, as they're too fast and too small to spot visually until it's too late.
Unless they have Sea-Whiz, which they don't, because it was invented very, very, very much later.
First US wave contained 10 planes and concentrated fire on the carriers, pretty much all the Japanese carriers would likely end up burning. In the real timeline, most Japanese carriers were destroyed after 3 to 5 hits, though one was destroyed with a single bomb. The US would not use only Harpoon missiles. The carrier probably doesn't have that many, though the exact number can only be approximated. Given the numbers produced and known operational usage of the missile, it's possible each US supercarrier on a mission carries a few hundred Harpoon missiles. The exact
few hundred, that's enough to take down the carriers and the bigger battleships. Definitely enough. It's enough, definitely, to take down the Yamato, not Yamamoto, Yamato.
Composition of what weapons a carrier has is not only secret but is flexible, depending on the mission. One can only deduce the possible range of weapons based on the disclosed total ordnance weight carried. For Nimitz carrier, that is 2,600 tons. Keep in mind, the figures shown are not likely accurate. They are just ballpark estimates of what could be possible. After the initial onslaught, the Japanese fleet would be in disarray. Their surface ships were capable of dealing with planes at close distances, not with... The
surface ships and battleships, for example, they see the aircraft carriers burning. What can they do? They cannot shoot anything because the American supercarrier is so far away, you cannot shoot it. You don't have a target because the planes F-18s are so fast. What can you do? You're on board of the Yamato, you see everything burning and just choo, 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 the planes are flying and they're so loud that the glass on board will break, will shatter because of the sound. And you're like, oh, what can we do? Are they going to shoot the F-18s with the huge 200mm Yamato cannons? I don't think so. They are sitting ducks and they will sink.
With F-18s flying at altitudes of 15,000 feet or more, dropping laser-guided bombs. With targeting pods assessing the damage and no pressure to go about it quickly, weapons usage could be made efficient, not wasting many bombs on the same target, especially since laser guidance could hit the most crucial parts of the ships. The U.S. carrier could launch another 2 waves while holding a dozen planes for self-protection.
Yeah, the problem we had back in Midway times when the carrier couldn't launch planes because they had to refuel and get the planes ready on the deck. Well, modern carriers have the super launching, how do you call it? Well, it launches the plane with the vacuum or with yeah, it was a pressurized air. It's like, it's immediately up. The launching and landing processes are so fast. You can launch at, I think at least 3 to 4 times as many planes as the Japanese carrier could. Plus the carrier planes, Japanese planes couldn't do anything anyway. They could just launch a wave after wave after wave without losing time, without losing anything. Just launch them indefinitely.
Possibly 100 more hits could be delivered, with dozens of Japanese ships being sunk. Within several hours, the leftover Japanese ships could get maybe a little over 100 miles away before the repeated attacks from the carrier come. It is likely some of the ships would eventually escape, but the Japanese Navy would still suffer an extreme blow. Pretty much all of their fleet carriers would be lost, as well as over a third of their other large surface vessels. Perhaps even...
It's crazy how Japanese had 9 carriers. It's mind-boggling to me. 9 carriers. US had a lot of carriers, but Japanese Navy was the big... Did they have more carriers than the US back then? 9. If they have sent the whole pack of 9 carriers to Midway, I think they would have for sure won the battle. For sure.
Even several submarines, as they would be hunted by US helicopters. US ships would likely keep the distance, so as not to be ambushed by a luckily positioned submarine. Besides going for Midway, Japanese forces of the real timeline also performed assaults further north, attacking Kiska and Attu Islands near Alaska. The thing is, the Japanese up north would likely be alerted. Some of the Japanese ships from the Midway battle would radio in what happened to their northern force. Since that force also had lots of slower supply ships and transport ships that needed protection, the northern Japanese fleet could flee at relatively slow 11 knots.
Yeah, I think if the Navy finds out what happened to the ships, they are all sunk. What really happened after the loss of Midway? Japan pulled back most of its navy to defend the home island, and they never left to the open ocean again. And I think after this defeat, they would pull back everything, because they know, oh, the enemy has some futuristic weapon. We better not go and play with them. We're gonna go back home.
US fleet could steam at a very high speed of possibly 25 to 30 knots, weather permitting. But another issue arises with great speed. Fuel usage skyrockets. While the carrier itself uses nuclear fuel, the escort ships do not. They're limited to a certain range. The US fleet might catch up after some 5 days, by which time the Japanese might already be quite close to the Japanese mainland, and enjoy the added protection of multiple submarines and possibly hundreds of Japanese planes. They might even be able to set up an ambush.
Yeah, okay, hundreds of planes. Let's say 500 Zeros versus 10 F-18s. There is just no way the Zeros could do anything to the F-18s. They cannot climb that high. They cannot go so fast. Plus, their weapons are just machine guns. They don't have missiles, just machine guns.
Of course, the Japanese might go in multiple directions using roundabout routes. They could separate their fleet. The actual chances that the US carrier could find and engage most of the Japanese northern fleet before it reaches the Japanese mainland are slim. And for what? So US escort ships could spend a little over 40% of their fuel just to reach the Japanese mainland? The US fleet would indeed be severely limited by fuel. Going to mainland Japan would mean a lot more fuel would be needed for a return to any sort of a base, say at Pearl Harbor, especially because Hawaii would still be without any real defenses, so their presence there might be of utmost importance. Instead of a chase, if the Aleutian Islands do get invaded, the carrier and its escorts might eventually sail at 10 knots or so, and help retake the islands. For that to happen, some new assets would need to be created or repurposed for the US Navy, such as transport ships, which would take quite some time. One destroyer and some helicopters might be left around Hawaii for added protection. A single berg could still be quite dangerous for any Japanese fleet. While harpoons might not be available.
Right, a modern helicopter, I think, might be in trouble if a bunch of Zeros attack it. Yes, that's a fair comparison. A helicopter could be taken down with machine guns. Enough machine gun fire could take it down, I think. But they have to be very accurate. Plus, the helicopters nowadays fly very fast, almost as fast as the Zeros do.
Anti-air missiles also have anti-ship capabilities. The more numerous SM-2 missile is range limited due to radar horizon. SM-6 has its own terminal guidance system and a longer range when guided by a helicopter in the mid-flight stage. Another option is the Penguin anti-ship missile, launched from a helicopter. Its range is more than adequate against World War II forces with a fair-size warhead. While a carrier going solo without any escorts could provide the US with great flexibility and speed, its anti-submarine protection would be severely limited if it did that. There would be no outside perimeter of ships and their sonars, both hull-mounted ones and towed behind ships, and the overall number of anti-submarine helicopters would be lower, possibly by half. With just one crucial asset, the US side would be unlikely to risk its carrier in offensive ops without escorts. While World War II subs are primitive compared to modern threats, it is still possible that in certain weather conditions and littoral waters, the periscope would not be detected in time, especially with fewer helicopters flying around the carrier. While the slow Japanese subs could not hope to catch the carrier, if the carrier went near Japanese mainland, a silent waiting sub may get lucky as the carrier stumbles into its range.
Right, but Carrier's armor is quite thick, isn't it? What do you know about it? I don't know much, but Yamato had a very thick armor, and that was the biggest ship at that time. But Carriers are modern, and the materials are modern. Could a torpedo back from that time penetrate the modern Carrier's armor? Is it possible?
The Japanese would have upward of 50 more submarines left, which would not be a harmless force in home waters against a lone carrier. Minefields would also be a concern for a lone carrier trying to approach Japanese lands without as many helicopters to sweep for them. Combined with the fuel issue, all that would likely prevent the US from going too close to the Japanese mainland. But the likely targets besides the Aleutian Islands might be liberating the Wake Island and possibly even Guam, though Guam, due to its distance, might be too much of a waste fuel-wise. How much could the carrier air group help in retaking?
We actually have, where is Guam? Okay, we don't have an order from Guam. I remember Estonian's YouTuber Cup competition, we had many orders from Guam actually, but nobody has gotten hat from there, Estonian soldier hat. So if you're from Guam and watching, go and get a hat.
Those islands. Its planes could perform upward of 50 strike sorties per day, dropping possibly 200 or more guided bombs per day. With targeting pods available, searching for targets and assessing the damage would be fairly easy, so Japanese forces on the islands might be quite pinned down as the US infantry disembarks. Added firepower might come in the way of ships' main guns. Leaving one destroyer to defend Hawaii, two ships could lay some decent fire on the island. While helicopters might be vulnerable to enemy fighters, it's more than likely a surprise first strike would wipe out most of the Japanese planes on the ground, and the remainder would be dealt with by F-18s. Air combat wouldn't be fair once again. Japanese planes in the air would have no way of knowing they are being targeted, and both heat-seeking and radar-seeking missiles would have no issues locking onto Zero fighters.
Heat-seeking and radar-seeking missiles taking down Zeros, which are wooden planes with a little bit of metal somewhere, seems like an overkill. Maybe they're Zeros might be so soft that the heat-seeking missiles wouldn't even explode on impact. Zeros are soft. There's almost no metal in them. A little bit, yes, the engine, and I've heard that even their gas tanks, how do you call them, fuel tanks, are not reinforced. They were not reinforced, they were just metal, but they were not armored, as the US planes were back then. So, heat-seeking missiles. One missile could take down many Zeros if they were close together, but one missile taking down one Zero is a strong overkill, I think.
Let alone anything bigger. Today's missiles can engage small objects such as cruise missiles from decent distances. Besides bombs, which are quite plentiful on a carrier, Another limiting factor would be aviation fuel carried. Nimitz-class carriers have enough fuel for roughly up to 1,500 aircraft sorties. That means that 70
1,500 sorties. You could take down an entire Japanese army with this. 1,500 sorties. One sortie could take down an entire fortification of the island.
aircraft-strong air wing might hope to fly for 2 to 3 weeks, with one sortie per plane per day. Overall, securing the Aleutian Islands, then Wake, then Guam might be doable at 10 knot speed, just enough for the carrier to return to Pearl Harbor, perhaps leaving another destroyer and some helicopters at Wake or Guam.
It's crazy how powerful this carrier is. It could do 10,000 miles without having to refuel. Not the carrier, but the planes and, escort ships. 10,000 miles, that is a lot of miles, without having to refuel.
For defense. After that, the remaining escort would be out of fuel, and most probably the aviation fuel on the carrier itself would be very low. So what happens at that point depends on what one allows for in this scenario. If the carrier group is to receive no help from the US World War II forces, it would eventually be game over. The Japanese would slowly regain courage and advance along the front. Upon seeing there is little US resistance, as the US Navy of the time is being rebuilt from scratch, they might go on the offensive again. The carrier would be ill-advised to try and hunt down the remaining Japanese carriers and battleships, as a search would require too much fuel. Modern carrier and its planes would simply be too limited by their supplies. With the carrier group out of the picture, Japan would surely advance.
Wait, what the hell? Why can't they refuel? Just refuel and attack everything, destroy everything. What? Okay, yeah, if you run out of fuel, then it's game over, but I didn't understand when did this become a fact that they cannot refuel. Oh, because the fuel they use haven't been invented yet? Right? I'm not sure.
Much more than it would otherwise, but eventually the US Navy would get rebuilt and ultimately push the Japanese back. Rebuilding would take time though. Ships themselves could be fairly quickly replaced. US already had many under construction in 1942. The emergency shipbuilding program churned out literally thousands of various tanker, cargo and transport ships. Even big item ships were commissioned in large numbers post-1942. So it is evident that the US Navy actually grew several-fold during the war. The existing assets of the spring of 1942 were not the majority of the total US forces by the end of the war. So the rebuilt US Navy would have overtaken the entire Japanese Navy by 1943 or so. It would take time to train new sailors though, especially considering the experienced core of the officers and engineers would not exist, so that would take another year or two to get to some usable proficiency levels. For comparison, the Japanese shipbuilding from 1942 onward was fairly small. So the Japanese would eventually be stripped of their gains in the Pacific and sheer numbers would still prevail. Nuclear bombs would likely be used in much greater numbers over the course of 1945, until the eventual surrender. But how about the scenario where World War II US does help the carrier force as much as possible, not only fighting alongside it, but also with the US nation supplying the carrier? New arresting cables and various parts might be made. Jet fuel too could be made.
Yeah, if they have jet fuel, if they have fueling, you wouldn't need the Navy of the US. You just use this one carrier to take down an entire country of Japan. They just need to refuel. Alright my friends, I will end this video here because it will get very long. It is a very long video. So you can let me know if you want more Binkov's Battlegrounds. Now, I don't know which conclusion he's gonna make in the end, but I'm gonna say it. There's no way you can fight against this Supercarrier, whatever. No way, no. It would win, I think so. Let me know in the comments what you want, guys. And thank you for watching. Thank you for being on Patreon. Thank you for getting the merch, my friends. And as always, until my next video, stay cool and bye-bye.